Thank you. As a Palestinian Australian, we have watched our families be slaughtered, our communities decimated, and our people dehumanised. Our government has been complicit in Israel's genocide. And there have been 21 weeks worth of sustained protests and actions across this nation. Australians have come out, tens of thousands of them, time and again, saying they do not want to be complicit in Israel's war crimes and genocide. Is it not about time that the government and the opposition party call for a permanent ceasefire and an end to the illegal occupation? And also, to add, hold them to account for their war crimes.
All right. Okay, I want to bring in Nathan Thrall, who has written extensively about these issues and lives in Jerusalem. I mean, you've heard that question, and thank you, very emotional question too, about the sustained calls for a permanent ceasefire. People are doing this around the world, not just in Australia. Is the world listening?
No, the world isn't listening. There absolutely needs to be an immediate ceasefire, and the US and its allies are absolutely complicit in what is happening in Gaza right now. And there is no excuse, because this war is going to end at some point, and it's going to end with Hamas not defeated. Hamas isn't going to be eliminated. So this war is going to end with Hamas still in place. And the only difference between a ceasefire now and a ceasefire later is thousands of women and children killed, and who knows how many Israeli hostages killed. So absolutely, the US and its allies are 100% complicit in what's happening.
Dr. Rifi, there is currently a negotiation around a ceasefire. As we speak, obviously, there is no deal yet. The US president had suggested it was close. We're not quite there yet, although some positive reporting tonight, although we've learnt not to make any declarations before that's all sealed. Do you feel like the government, the opposition, are listening to the calls?
Without any doubt, our government capacity to do anything about the macro-political level in the Middle East is very limited. It's very small. I think we've heard the Vice President of USA is making the call today about an immediate ceasefire, and that is of significance. Except we are talking about Netanyahu and his far-right government. And Netanyahu has actually lived all his life against two-state solution, and he wanted this war to keep on going, because that's the only way he can protect himself, and he only interested in protecting himself. Unfortunately, he's not working for the nation of Israel, and at the same time, he is not counting how many people, kids, women, are being dead. An immediate ceasefire has to be called, and be called immediately. For our leaders, to be honest, I think actually if they call to ceasefire, or they haven't called to ceasefire, does not make much difference, except what they need to be calling upon is actually clear messaging about how we in Australia should prevent this war coming into our shore, and how we can disagree better in Australia.
We will get to that theme, because it is a really important one. But Katy Gallagher, you heard Mai's question. She's asking a question about a permanent ceasefire, clearly, and I'm going to speak. I'd love to hear again from you in a moment, Mai, but you know, the government has been incrementally moving in that direction, but you're not calling for a permanent ceasefire.
Well, I think it was probably a couple of months ago now, we called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. That had to happen on both sides, because we still have the case of hostages being held, and obviously the harrowing scenes that we're all watching from the Middle East and in Gaza in particular. We've been working with Canada and New Zealand and issuing strong statements, and, we have to, think, be realistic about the amount of influence and voice we have, but where we can use it, we should use it. I was at the G20 meeting last week of foreign ministers. Obviously, the situation in the Middle East was one of those topics that every country was raising, wanting to see a solution, wanting to see, a way through, a pathway to peace. We've got to provide more humanitarian assistance. We've got some of that flowing at the moment. The money that Senator Wong has increased. And we have to be realistic about a two-state solution. We have to be working with allies, but any country that wants to work, that wants to see an end to the war in the Middle East and an end to the suffering. But I think certainly on a ceasefire, we were there a couple of months ago calling for that so that we can actually get humanitarian assistance in and also have those discussions, particularly led by the US, into a pathway to peace.
May, Dr. Jamal Rifi mentioned the fact that Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the US today, has actually made some very strong comments. Clearly the Australian government says they've been calling for a ceasefire. Is that good enough?
No, it's not.
What's not good enough about it?
Because it's politicking. Israel has been charged to be an apartheid regime. It has been, yes, by international organisations, including Amnesty International.
Yeah, it's been accused of that,
yes.
That's right.
It has now been brought in front of the ICJ, basically clearly stating that it needs to make sure that there is aid flowing into Gaza, that it needs to not commit genocide, and it is actively has a policy of limiting aid going into Gaza. And what we're seeing right now are people starving to death. We literally, not a few days ago...
What more can our government do,
Our government can do a lot. Our government can impose ministerial sanctions. It could, sanctions. It can recall ambassadors. It can say to Israel, what you're committing is a war crime, and we don't support this. We have a human rights obligation. We can continue funding UNRWA. There are so many things our government can actually do. To say that you've called for a humanitarian pause doesn't mean you've called for a permanent ceasefire. It means a pause, let's get some aid in.
No, we've said
and people
ceasefire.
can still...
We haven't said pause, and we are funding UNRWA. There is a review going in at the moment, but we have significantly increased funding to UNRWA to make sure that we are doing what we can, and Senator Wong has flagged more assistance in coming days. We have had, the ambassador has been spoken to, the Israeli ambassador, about some of the concerns in terms of the situation in Gaza. So that has been happening. I think, for us, there has been a lot of, well, perhaps because this is raised quite rightly, the protests you talk about and the sort of community disharmony that we're seeing in Australia. I mean, part of our job is to make sure that what is happening and what we are doing is being understood, because there has been a level, I think, of either misunderstanding or misreporting.
Okay, so you're saying you're calling for a permanent ceasefire?
We've called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We've called for negotiations with all the parties on a pathway to peace and in recognition that we believe that
and do you think the Netanyahu government is going too far?
Solution.
Do you think this is
We have
disproportionate?
said that Israel should follow international law, and how Israel responds matters. And we have also
they,
said, do not
following international law.
We have also said, we have also said, sorry, I'll just finish this, that how they respond matters, and that we have asked, particularly on their escalation into Rafah, that do not go down this path. I mean, that is the language we have been using and using in the last month or so. I used it last week at the G20 meeting. So I think the language there is
I just want to bring in Nathan, who lives here and has written extensively on it. The US is using strong language now. Is the Netanyahu government listening?
No, and it's false also to say that the US is really exerting any pressure on Israel.
Their language has changed.
Okay, but they have actual leverage that they're not using. And these are US bombs that are being used in Gaza, and the US could stop this war very quickly, and it's not. I just want to touch on a couple of things that were said. One, on the question of apartheid. This was a finding of a United Nations Special Rapporteur, the leading human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, leading Palestinian human rights organizations like Al-Haq, and leading Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, and also former senior government officials of Israel, including former ministers and the leading legal authority of former Attorney General of Israel. So this is not a controversial finding. This is something that has reached a point of near consensus in the international human rights community. Secondly, when the ICJ was just looking, following the genocide case, they looked at the question of the legality of Israel's prolonged, more than half-century long occupation just now, and over 20 nation states found that Israel is practicing apartheid in their filings to the ICJ. So this is reaching a consensus, and it's not a controversial position. I also want to touch on what Mai had said about a ceasefire not being sufficient. And the reason a ceasefire isn't sufficient is because it's not addressing the root problem. All the time we have these wars in Gaza, and the world says, let's restore calm. It's terrible. There's an uprising in the West Bank. There's violence. There's a war in Gaza. Let's restore calm. What is the calm that we're asking to be restored? It's a system in which Israel is a sole sovereign between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, with 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians, and the vast majority of those Palestinians do not have basic civil rights. Now, that is a system of gross injustice. It's lasted for more than half a century.
And you live in that system.
The U.S. and its allies are supporting this system. They're vetoing UN Security Council resolutions. They're withholding any kind of accountability. There are no consequences. So, of course, Israel chooses to perpetuate this system. It is much better for them. If the choices are continue as it is and the world will wag its finger, or you give the Palestinians citizenship or sovereignty, they choose the first.
You live there, right? And
Yes.
and you've been speaking about these issues. What's so uncomfortable about you in that experience? Just talk to me about your experience, because you do have rights in that system. Why does that nag at you?
Well, I think it would nag at any Australian who lived in that system, anybody who comes from a democratic country.
But it doesn't nag at everyone, does it?
Well, it doesn't nag at many Israelis because they're in the privileged class, and they are not discriminated against based on their inborn characteristics. But all of us who live in democratic societies believe that there should not be special rights granted or withheld from people on the basis of their inborn characteristics. It's very simple.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kiko.
Yep.
This is the problem. Decent people recoiled in horror at the attack on the 7th of October, and decent people want this conflict to end on all sides. But when we move this conversation to what has just occurred, which is questioning the entire existence of Israel, and that's what we're being asked here to talk about, then that's not a constructive path to peace. Right now, there's a potential negotiation in Cairo, and anyone who wants to actually have this end in a negotiated outcome would want Hamas and Israel to come to that in good faith. A simple request was made of Hamas to provide particulars of the hostages who are still kept by a terrorist state, and they refused to provide those particulars of the hostages. If you want this war to end, and I do, those hostages have to come home. They have to come home.